I am remembering Charlie Kirk, one of the best disseminators of the ideas of freedom. I reference who never turned his back on open debate. His death must not paralyze us. We have an obligation to move forward and not retreat from the battle for ideas. Sooner or later, good and truth will triumph. Having said this, I'm very happy to be here today with all of you. I am very happy that CPAC, the most important right-wing summit on the planet, has reached Paraguay. And I hope that it will soon be present throughout South America, living the cultural battle throughout and across the continent. In Argentina, we began to celebrate the CPAC summit last year, on a truly historic day for the city of freedom in our country, and that we are eager to be able to repeat or even overcome it. Thank you to Cedro, the regional CPAC, for inviting me. And also thank you to all who have come to listen to me. It is always a privilege for me to take every opportunity to bring the ideas of freedom to all corners of the planet. I want to start by saying that Paraguay is an example of what needs to be done in economic matters, both for my country and for the rest of South America. Decades ago, they chose to embrace the ideas of freedom, and as a consequence, they have managed to make inflation a thing of the past. And they have not stopped growing in the last 20 years. Thanks to the Macola regime, they have been able to explore their local industry to the maximum, increasing exports and generating genuine jobs. Their experience proves that when regulations accompany and do not interfere, when taxes are low and do not suffocate, the capacity of countries to trade grows, creating better goods and services of better quality at a better price. On the other hand, we in Argentina, who are only at one border of distance, during the last 20 years have done everything in a diametrically opposite way. We set up an elephant state with enormous public spending. We took on debt with all the existing market agents, to whom we would later end up defaulting. Once we lost our credibility, we printed cases to finance uncontrolled spending and added census expropriations, corruption with the public sector, and an endless number of calamities. Growing as a country became something literally impossible. In fact, there is a very strong phrase that Milton Friedman used to use, and that is foreign students always asked him when they asked him about something. And he said, first the data, first the data. What do the data say? Well, in this the data are categorical. The results are visible. Between 2012 and 2024, Paraguay grew at an annual rate of 3.1%, while Argentina decreased at a rate of 0.1% per year in the same period. That is to say that in terms of per capita, I would say that we are almost 15% below. A truly terrifying setback. In fact, when we arrived in government, poverty, when it was corrected by what has to do with price controls, and the sincereness of the variables was 57%. The inflation was running at 1.5% daily. And obviously, we also had great financial problems in the central bank and in Treasury. And the consolidated fiscal deficit was 15 points of the GDP. But beyond the calamity in which the Argentine economy was, at the moment in which we arrived at power, we'd also be making many mistakes from time to time. In addition, the Argentines even wasted the opportunity of our lives when we opposed the ALCA in 2005, in what would have been the largest and most beneficial free trade agreement in our history. A tremendous error that we ended up paying very expensively later. But that only did not harm Argentina, but also the rest of the region, by preventing the agreement from prospering among the other nations. Thank God, 2 years ago the Argentines chose to change. They decided to say enough of misery. And in December 2023 they chose as president a libertarian liberal to put into practice a process of profound reform that at this point was already being demanded. And thanks to that mandate that we committed to fulfilling, we launched a monetary and exchange tax order plan that began to yield important results. Basically, we put into order the accounts of the National Treasury in the first month of management. In the middle of the year, we put the accounts of the central bank in order. And from that moment, we stopped the monetary emission. Not only that, but we also made about 9,000 structural reforms. For example, the drop in inflation, where we are now on the brink of a new imperial inflationary process. In other words, inflation was rising by 1.5% daily. Today it is 1.5% in inflation, but in monthly terms. I say that it ceases to be a flagellum for Argentina. We must take into account that the inflationary tax is one of the most regressive taxes that exist. And that, for example, allowed us to drop in inflation. The social contention mechanisms of the Human Capital Ministry and the recovery of the economy, with what it had matched in times of real salary improvement. In this period that we reached in the government, poverty went from 57% to 30%. That is, 12 million Argentines lifted out of poverty. And in terms of poverty, today 6 million Argentines who did not eat before. Today they do eat because they were lifted out of poverty. At the same time, in parallel, we are the first government in the last few years. And we are the second government in the last few years. At the same time, in parallel, we are the first government in the last 123 years of history. There has a zero deficit after the payment of interest. We understood that the root of all the evils of the Argentine economy was the tax deficit, a product of addiction to public spending. Like Paraguay, we understood that balancing accounts and maintaining them in order should be the backbone of any genuine change process. After all, any project, any of its kind, can be built on the basis of spending more than what is collected. The times that has been tried and have always ended in catastrophe, as it has been recorded in the sad history of our country during the last century. In fact, Argentina has tried that recipe. That has the name of the Keynesian recipe, which is nothing more or less than saying that the tax deficit is good, that the manipulation of the interest rate via monetary policy is good, regulations and control our freedoms. The truth is that Argentina has probably been the country that have applied it the most in history. And the consequence is clear, starting as a developed country. After almost a century of applying these crazy measures, Argentina has become a subdeveloped country, something never seen in history. That is why the model that we propose is inspired by the ideas of freedom that made the West great and that constitutes the foundations of our national constitution, and that led us to our golden era in the early 20th century. We recurrently, at the time of presenting our ideas, frequently work with the definition of liberalism, of who is our greatest exponent in the history of Argentine liberalism. which is Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch's son. We also have the privilege that one of his children, Bertie, is a national deputy in the province of Buenos Aires. And now we have managed that his brother Joaquin has decided to get into politics to be a candidate for senator for the province of Entre Rios National Senator. So we are filling the Congress of with pure liberals. That is why, in that context, it makes even more sense. The definition of liberalism of our greatest proponent of the ideas of freedom, which says that liberalism is the respect and restriction of the project of life of the neighbor, based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, to freedom and to property, whose institutions are property rights. Because without property rights there is no price mechanism, and therefore there is no economic calculation, and that leads to misery. Free markets or state intervention, because state intervention contaminates the price signal. Competitive markets are understood not in the neoclassical interpretation of the perfect competition, but in competitive markets understood under the logic of Baumol, Panzer and Willig. It is the idea of disputable markets or defiable markets. In English, this is contestable markets. And that maps very well with the idea of the Austrians in terms of competition. In turn, how we admit that human beings thank God we are all different. This favors the division of work and the division of what leads to social cooperation and prosperity. Because also, this, beyond these principles that made us coordinate with the powers of the world and transform the Argentine Republic in the proletarian land of those who are looking for a better future. It's very important as criteria at the time to define not only the north of a policy, but how to structure the policy. Our policy is based on moral criteria. That is, our note is that Argentina is the freest country in the world. And we know that this will bring us prosperity. But up to there, it is as if it were very abstract. And in reality, what counts at the time of making the decisions is to work with a moral framework. Because when you raise questions in moral terms, there is no place for gray. The things that are good, and the things that are bad are bad. I'm going to deal with, sorry that it is self-referential, but it is to show how we make decisions with moral criteria. When we received the government, the central bank generated a quasi-fiscal deficit at 10 points of the GDP. That generated inflation, that generated macroeconomic instability. And Argentina, as a result of this, had a changing sepulchre. That is, it was not possible to make transactions in foreign currency freely, without it being brutally persecuted by the repressive apparatus of the state. In fact, these are the images of the year 2023. People who are called little trees, who do shopping and selling of currency on the street, and were persecuted by the police. The reality is that these exchange controls are truly sinister. Because first of all, if you earn your money honestly, what power does an official have in saying whether he can spend it or not? In other words, one could spend the fruit of his work and whatever he wants, as long as it is legal. That was the first point. The second point is that given the depreciation that the currency was systematically carried, there was a destruction of ferocious wealth. Because notice that if someone in 2001 had $1,000, let's say if they want to do it at the price of today, if he had $1,400 and 1,400 pesos, if he stayed with $1,400, he is $1,400. And now if he stayed with the pesos today, he would have $1. Consequently, this means that it would also imply a huge loss of wealth, and therefore a huge loss of well-being. In addition, the controls are set at an artificially low price, and that basically generates an excess of demand for currency. And the opposite of the excess of demand for currency is an excess of supply in the rest of the economy, where there is an excess of supply in the market of bonds, which derives from the fact that the price of bonds is very low, and therefore the interest rate is very high, and therefore the country risk is very high. In fact, when we won the elections, the country risk was 3,000 basic points. Now, that high interest rate generates discoordination. That is, the country risk generates intertemporary discoordination between savings and investment, and that causes the consumption to drop as much as the investment, and therefore the economic activity sinks. When the economic activity sinks, the demand for work retracts. When the demand for work retracts, the salaries are either liquefied by inflation or are tapped by unemployment or some combination of both. In fact, the salaries in Argentina when we arrived were around $300. Today, they are around $1,100 minus $1,200. On the other hand, what that situation does is that poverty is generated. And in fact, when the variables were reported honestly, it went from the half-month frequency to the monthly one, and the prices were also reported honestly, because they were price controls. The real poverty that we inherited was 57%. That is a catastrophe. Therefore, for us it was fundamental to save the balance of the central bank and to liberalize the exchange market. So we stopped the monetary emission in Mimenes 2024. And then in an unprecedented program, with the International Monetary Fund, we proceeded to yield the assets of the central bank. Because basically what was done in Argentina was that the different governments placed untransferable letters in the central bank, titles that had no market value, and the dollars were taken away, and therefore left without backing. Basically the pesos that were going around, there is a kind of default on the pesos, and that basically, technically, is resolved by higher inflation. That is, and that was what happened in Argentina. Therefore, not only did we have to cut with the emission problem, but also it was not only the flow problem, but also that we had to correct the stock problem. And we did that with the agreement that we celebrated with International Monetary Fund, and that we signed in mid-April of this year, where basically we received a support package where the Treasury, those dollars that it received, used it to cancel debt with the central bank. In such a way as to end the inflationary scam. That is, the gross debt does not change, but the creditor changes. But the most important thing is to stop skimming Argentinians of goods that had pesos or that have pesos. When we proposed this, they said that we were not going to do it because it was basically an election scam and that there was no reason to take this risk. So notice that you're there facing a decision of economic policy where you have to think, or in utilitarian terms, with an electoral counterpart, and on the other hand, and doing what is correct, which is to embrace the ideas of freedom and advance liberty. And so it is that against all the prognosis that they said that we were not going to raise the debt because it was an election year, when we got the funding that gave us tranquility on the balance of the central bank, basically we decided to remove the debt because you did not negotiate with evil. You know what is right and what is wrong. Sorry that I'm deviating from the basis of what I brought as a speech. But there is a work that I recommend emphatically. A work of Professor José Huerta del Soto, which is called The Theory of Dynamic Efficiency. I recommend it, but very, very emphatically. In fact, when I decorated it, in his visit to Argentina, I just talked about the importance of his work of Professor Huerta del Soto. Because what I did with Professor Huerta del Soto is that the theory of dynamic efficiency has to do with finding that path that maximizes economic growth. But what this also points out is that something that is efficient cannot be unfair. That is, you, for the sake of the optimum, or in the name of the optimum, cannot be committing injustices and aberrations, because supposedly that utilitarian will give you something better, and that makes no sense. In fact, there is a wonderful book by Israel Kirchner, which is called Capitalism, Creativity in Distributive Justice, which when it starts, the discussion says, we know that the capitalist free enterprise system is more productive, but they accuse us that the system is unfair. And what Israel Kirchner says is, it is true that we are more productive, we are more efficient, but if the system is not fair, it is not worth defending it. What he does in that book, Israel Kirchner, is to show that the combination of the principle of appropriation of Locke added to the idea of Hayek of the markets as a process of discovery, that is, the capitalism of the free enterprise, is not only more efficient, but it is also the only system that is fair. And what comes from the work of Huerta de Soto is that if you go and embrace the fair values, the ethical values, the Judeo-Christian ethics, which is the ethics of the West, which is what is behind the capitalism of the free enterprise, that will be efficient. In other words, the most interesting thing about the work of Huerta de Soto is that you could put an economy on a dynamically efficient path. That is, that it maximizes economic growth, and you do not need to know about economics. All you need is to embrace the correct moral values. That is, to govern with ethical and moral criteria according to the values of the West. That is, a Judeo-Christian culture, which is what is behind the foundations of liberalism. And that is why it brings so much prosperity. And in fact, in the Argentine case, in this aspect, it is worth noting that during the last decades, we have lived the inverse process. Argentine talent was forced to seek opportunities in other lands. What had some countries stopped giving her? The possibility of fulfilling their dreams, of carrying out a life project. Look, without going further, the idea of social justice, which is our antagonistic model. To put it in some way, and social justice is actually unfair, because is anyone in here is in favor of theft? No one is in favor of theft. In fact, one of the commandments says, you will not steal. And not only that, well, also, in the light of Charlie Kirk, and in the light of the principle of non-aggression, non-aggression is also, you will not kill before right. I say so that they can see what is on the other side. But not only that, but also who would be in favor of an unequal treatment in front of the law. One of the great achievements of liberalism is to have race equality before the law, and that of stealing from one to give to another. The truth is that that is wrong. That is why it is very interesting. A couple of reflections on what Thomas Sowell says about it. He says social justice is more rhetorical envy. And the question that Thomas Sowell asks is, since when did envy stop being a capital sin to become a virtue? Because one of the characteristics that social justice has, which is the policy of envy, is the destruction of a society. Therefore, these kinds of questions are fundamental when making decisions, because one takes it to a level that is ethical and moral, and there it is clear what is right and what is wrong. I don't know, I can give you another example. What has to do with our security policy? And look, whoever does pays for it. I mean, and it works. So if you look at each of our policies, in the end, they all have an ethical and moral background. And that is what makes the economy. We have made the biggest tax cut in history. And when everyone predicted a brutal recession, the GDP, among other things, the monthly rate grew by 6%. In the first quarter, on average, it grew by 7%. Not only did the inflation go down from 1.5 daily to 1 monthly, that is to come from levels that it seemed that Argentina was going to end on a scale that could have reached 17,000, 18,000%. Today, it travels around 20%. And we hope that in the next year, half a year, inflation has disappeared. And in all that process, 12 million Argentines left poverty. 6 million Argentines started eating when they didn't eat before. So it's not that we have completed everything. We still have a long way to go. But we are clear that following the ethical and moral rules, Argentina will be great again. Also, it is important to understand that there are no third ways on this path. Any moderate option, in many quotes, is functional to the decadent system that we are leaving behind with so much effort. This is a wonderful job. This is a quote from Ludwig von Mises, which is called Interventionism, and the subtitle is The Myths of the Third Way. Mises says, there is free enterprise capitalism, and there is real socialism. Any intermediate solution tends to socialism, and that is poverty. In other words, this simply means that there is no moderate option between, for example, between the surplus and the deficit. There is no third way between a state devoted to its essential functions and one with a growing number of attributes that does a lot of things and does them all wrong. The Argentines have already rehearsed in the past to change gradually, making concessions and leaving without addressing aspects of the past that were wrong. That experience failed, and we have to learn from it. Should we change the half measures, or should we do the deep reforms that are needed, or should we stay halfway and get the solution again? That is why I see that the third ways are impotent or worse. Any intermediate, as rational as it may seem, leaves the door open to the worst of the past. Fortunately, if Argentina grows, and now people accompany us in the elections, we will be able to do great things with the future of our country, which we have a lot to learn from. In fact, as loyal followers of market freedom, we believe that each of our nations has a lot to contribute to the other, since it is through cooperation and voluntary exchange that peoples grow and prosper. That is precisely why it is vital that there are spaces like CPAC that contribute to the propagation and defense of the ideas that have made the West great. Thank you very much, dear, for such an amazing task that you carry. In addition, how many nice compliments did your wife give you? Now, applause for them. In the sense, in a context of increasing uncertainty in the free world, nothing better than to bet on a peaceful change of ideas as a way of reconnecting with the legacy of our ancestors, giants over whose shadows we are standing and he sacrificed in the name of humanity. Today we enjoy countless benefits. May the courage and ingenuity serve as a guide to those we want in the midst of this cultural battle between good and evil, to exalt the values that made us prosperous. I want to leave my memory for Charlie Cake. Thank you all for being here. May God bless you all. May the forces of heaven be with us. Long life freedom, damn it.